Hi everyone, it's Erin from the Provincial Farmhouse. Today I'm going to be creating some French country wall decor. For my project, I'm going to be using this little wooden tag that I bought quite a few Christmases ago. It was on sale, and my first step is to remove the twine hanging attachment. And then I'm going to be using Paint Couture's 2-in-1 primer in white. I'm going to be applying 2 coats of this front and back. It's definitely a good idea when you are working with an MDF piece that you do prime both sides. And I am making sure that I give it enough time in between coats, about an hour to dry, and then I want to wait about another hour before applying any other paint. Next, I took out Redesign's Enlightened Etchings mold, and I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Rapid Casting Resin. I'm going to be using a silicone cup today for my resin, and I'm going to begin by adding step 1. Now, to do the top scroll design, I needed to add 10 ml of step 1 and then of course 10 ml of step 2. You want to make sure you have equal parts, and then I stirred it really well for about 30 seconds. I'm then going to carefully pour that out. I find I get a bit more control when I squeeze the sides together, and this is going to be ready to take out in about 10 minutes. While that is curing, I took out Paint Couture's Buttercream chalk paint, and I'm going to be applying 2 coats, both front and back of this tag. I definitely wanted to go with an off-white for this, as I'm going for more of a vintage French country style today. And because I am working with chalk paint, I do need to remember to seal my paint as well. When my paint was dry, I took out Redesign's Mystic Hydrangea Transfer. So this is a 3-page transfer design. It did come out a little while ago, and I'm very excited to finally be able to use it. So for my project today, I am thinking of having a single hydrangea in the center of my project, and I did settle on the beautiful bluey colored hydrangea down the bottom there. After cutting out my transfer, I then took the casting out of the mold there, the resin casting, and now I need to start to have a bit of a think about arrangement. I want to put this casting up the top. Now, because my casting has only been out of the mold for a brief amount of time, I can bend it, and I also want to add in this stencil. I want it to say that Le Jardinier, which I believe means the gardener. And I am here just working out what kind of space I have to work with, and then I'm going to remove the hydrangea because I want to begin with a raised stencil, and I'm going to be using Paint Couture's embossing medium. I'm then going to use a palette knife to start scraping the embossing medium over the top of my stencil. So I'm going to be using bits and pieces of stencils and sort of rearranging how they are laid out, but I really love using embossing medium because it definitely just makes that text stand out, and I think it just gives projects a bit more character rather than it just being sort of like a flat design. I'm also going to use the embossing medium over the top of that beautiful scroll piece that's underneath the text there. And then once I'm happy with that and I've sort of smoothed out all of that embossing medium, I'm going to gently pull that back. Once that was dry, I went in with my craft knife, and I'm just going to trim off the ends of my casting there. It doesn't quite fit, and I am going to use those in another part of this craft. So after I cut them off, I did put them to one side for use later. I then used a combination of Gorilla Super Glue Gel and also hot glue on the back of my casting. Now you will see me position this, and it did have a really good hold, but in the end I do end up deciding to reposition my casting because I felt like it was a little bit too low, it was a little bit too close to my stenciled design. So later you will see me change that. But first I then went in and added that Redesign Hydrangea transfer in the center. So I'm just positioning that where I want it to go. My paint is of course very dry. It's been dry for several hours, and then I'm going to use the transfer stick to begin rubbing. I like to go all the way over the top of my transfer first to make sure it's all stuck down, and then I lift up a portion of the plastic and I start lifting that and rubbing, and that just helps the transfer to release. So I'm going to repeat that process until I have the entire image transferred. If you don't have access to a transfer like this, you could definitely use a stamp or perhaps some decoupage paper instead. Once I was finished with my transfer, I then used Paint Couture's Extreme Guard in Satin to seal the transfer design. So I'm doing this so that I can protect my transfer because I am going to be layering in other products over the top, and I just want to make sure that nothing's going to happen to that image. I'm going to be layering other products over the top, like I said, so the sheen doesn't really matter to me, but if you don't like a shiny finish, obviously you could use matte here instead. When that was dry, I did pull off the casting off camera, and here you can see I'm just working out how I could reposition it. I did have some paint pull off in one section, but I'll be able to paint over the top of that and hide it. So I'm just going to repeat the same process as before, adding that super glue gel and a little bit of hot glue, and then I'm going to reposition it a bit higher up the top. The main reason I used resin for this piece is because, as you can see, it is overlapping with my tag and I want it to be sturdy. Next, I repositioned the stencil that we used up the top. I want to have some of that other lettering just sort of overlapping with the hydrangea a little bit. So I'm just going to repeat the same process as before, applying that embossing medium over the top of the stencil. You will notice though that I always have my other hand in place holding that there just to make sure that it doesn't shift. When that was dry, I took out another stencil from my stash and I'm going to reposition it down the bottom. I really love the address and the text down the bottom. So I'm just going to go repeat the same process, add that embossing medium over the top. If I can find the links for these stencils, I will put them in the description below. When that was dry, I went in and touched up that area where the paint had pulled back with Paint Couture's Buttercream chalk paint, and then I'm also going to continue to go over the top of my resin casting. And I'm also going to make sure I get it in all those other angles, and this chalk paint sticks really well to resin. If you are worried, however, you could definitely put a primer on that casting first. Next, I decided to take those little offcuts that I cut at the beginning, and I'm going to add some Gorilla Super Glue Gel to the back of those, and I'm going to position them down the bottom. And I really think this was just a nice little touch, and it also means that I'm not wasting that resin casting. Once that glue was dry, I then went in with some more of that buttercream over the top of the castings we just glued down. When that was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Crackle Step 1. I'm going to apply an even coat over the top of my tag, so everything except for the castings. And I am making sure that I've got good coverage, that it's over the entire design. Sometimes to do that, I did have to sort of go at an angle to let that light catch where the product is, because obviously this product is clear. And I am being sure not to let it pull around in the raised stencil details. I then let that dry for about 30 minutes and came in with Crackle Step 2, and I'm going to apply it in the same places, obviously, that we have Crackle Step 1. Now this is a bit of a thicker medium, so I did have to be mindful of that as I was applying it and making sure that I had good coverage. If you don't like a vintage look, obviously the Crackle Step is something that you could definitely leave out, or you could use IOD's Vintage Textures stamp. They have a crackle option that you could use as well. I used a hairdryer to speed up the drying process, but then I decided that I would flip it over and I would go in with some of that buttercream chalk paint. I am going to be tidying up the back and adding a design in, and I wanted to use this time to allow my crackle to dry further to make sure I didn't reactivate it with water. I'm then going to be using this napkin. Now this is one that I picked up a while ago from TK Maxx, and I thought it really fit in quite well with my project because we've obviously got those lovely blue hydrangeas. Because it is a napkin, I am going to have to peel those extra layers off, and there was another 2 layers that I had to remove, so I just very carefully did that. And then I came in with Paint Couture's Decoupage Medium in matte. I'm going to apply a generous coat on the back. Obviously my buttercream chalk paint is completely dry, so I'm going to go over, make sure that's even, that I've got the Decoupage Medium all over the back. And then I'm going to position the napkin in the wet medium. Now, when you're working with napkins, you definitely want to be a bit more gentle. Obviously, it's a lot more delicate. So I'm going to carefully position it in the wet medium, and then I'm going to start smoothing it out. I did lift it up a couple of times to try and get some of those air bubbles out. But ultimately, I decided that I would embrace a lot of the wrinkles. I really quite liked the texture that this particular napkin achieved. It almost reminded me a little bit of rice paper. And it definitely went with that sort of vintage feel that I was going for. So here I'm going in with another coat of the Decoupage Medium over the top. It's also helping me to smooth it out and to remove any air bubbles. But again, we are going to embrace those wrinkles. I'm not really worried about that at all. I just wanted a nice background so that it just looked a little bit tidier. When that was dry, I went in with a block of 220 grit sandpaper, and I'm running that in a vertical motion over the edges of my project, and that's going to help me to be able to sand back and pull back that excess napkin. So I'm just going to continue to work my way around my project until I've removed all of that excess. Up the top where the casting was, I did end up using a craft knife to remove the excess there. Next, I turn my attention back to the front, and I'm going to be using Paint Couture's Van Dyke Brown Antiquing Glaze. I'm going to begin with the casting up the top. I'm using a tapered tip brush. That's really helping me to really work that glaze into all of those lower points on the casting. And I am also going to be using a mister as well to help move that product a little bit further. These are water-based products, so you can do that. And I'm just going to continue to add that glaze starting up the top. Because this paint is not sealed up the top, so that's why I'm just working in a small section to begin with. And then I'm going to use a wet wipe to pull that back so that it just sits in the low points and gives us that beautiful definition and obviously that old world look. And then I'm going to start adding more glaze. Now, I'm not having much glaze on my brush as I'm working on that center part, and then I'm using a wet wipe and a light hand to go in and sort of spread it and also pull some of it back. I'm going to continue to add the glaze. Obviously, we're going to add it on the castings, basically everywhere we are adding that. But as I said before, I am going to wipe a lot of it back because I don't want it to be too dark. I just want it to have that lovely old world look. When that was dry, I took out Paint Couture's Pitch Black Chalk Paint, and I'm going to reposition the stencils that I used earlier. And as you can see, I'm going over the top of those areas, but this time I'm going in with the black. So we obviously have the raised element of the embossing medium, but I wanted the text to stand out a little bit more. Now, if you quite liked the way it looked in the white, obviously you could leave this step out, or you could come in with some other colors that suit your decor for this step. I decided to just go with the black, but then once it was dry, I went in with a wet wipe, and I'm just going to lightly rub over the top of that, and it's going to pull some of it back and give it that more of a worn vintage look. And I really do like this effect. I did have to be careful not to press too hard. I don't want to sort of smudge the paint. But obviously we do have that crackle down as well, so that did act as a little bit of a barrier. And then I'm going to go in and reposition the text that's over the top of the Hydrangeas down the bottom, and I'm going to repeat that same process, adding that pitch black chalk paint. Just like before, once that paint was dry, I did go in and do a bit of distressing with the wet wipe. I then repositioned the other stencil and the address down the bottom and went in with that pitch black again. You'll notice there was a few areas that I left out because I'm going to go in and I'm going to be using bronze Lux Metallic instead on those sections. And again, just repositioning that. And however, with this, I am sort of brushing it on a little bit more as opposed to doing any dabbing. So this is a Lux Metallic, so it's going to give us a lovely shine. And I'm also going to be repositioning the other stencil down the bottom and adding it to the little scroll details there. I did end up missing the one that was that line that was underneath the hydrangea section, but I do go back and fix that a bit later. While I have the bronze out, I then went in and added the bronze over the top of that beautiful casting up the top. I'm brushing it on. I'm not going for full coverage at all here, but I do want a little bit of shine. so that we can really highlight the beautiful shape of that. I did then decide to go in and start doing some bronze speckles. This was actually because I had dropped a little bit of the bronze onto the surface and I thought, well, that looks nice. So I decided to embrace it and I went in and did some more speckles. I then went in with the bronze while I had that brush out, and I went over the top of the details on the edges, and I'm actually running my brush over the edges so that you can see the product. So it's sort of framing it out. We're going to have a very thin sort of bronze uneven line around the edge to frame it out. And I really like the look of this because it does add to that old world feel, but it's also going to colour the edges of my tag in that lovely bronze. Once I finished adding the bronze around the edges, I decided that I would go in with some black and do some black speckles on top of my artwork, because that does, to me, give me that look of age and interest. Obviously, this is a step that you could leave out if this wasn't to your taste. Next, I did end up going back in and fixing up the line that I'd missed out on stenciling. Finally, when that was dry, I took out the brush that I'd been using with the Buttercream chalk paint, offloaded most of that paint, and now I'm dry brushing over the top of my castings. I'm going to also do that to the little ones in the bottom corners, and I'm also going to lightly brush it over the top of the black text to give it a bit more of a vintage look. If I inspire you to try any of the Redesign or Paint Couture products used in today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would use my affiliate link. I will put it in the description below. And here's a look at our finished French country wall art. I love how this turned out. I think the combination of the Redesign mold with the hydrangeas and the raised stencils just worked out really well, and I think the napkin on the back was just a really nice finishing touch. But let me know what you think of today's project in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, comment, and share it out. If you haven't already, I would love it if you would hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of our videos. You can find a full product list and my affiliate links in the description below. Thanks for watching.